Well, the city of Rockport, Texas is right in Harvey's path and is getting hit hard.
This is intensifying. It's expected to keep getting stronger.
It is a colossal rescue effort. Thousands stranded, taken by boat and helicopter.
The water's so high, the boats are going over top of the cars.
Saved using anything that floats.
150-mile-an-hour winds ripping buildings apart, knocking out power everywhere. All of the electricity is out tonight.
A Category 5 storm has prompted hurricane warnings in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Florida is under a state of emergency.
There are dozens of homes like this.
We begin with the fire disaster unfolding in California tonight. At least 22 wildfires are still burning. They are growing and threatening more homes.
Since exploding Sunday night, the fires still out of control, torching 170,000 acres.
As you can tell, Bill, there's so much that did not make it through here.
Hundreds of volunteers have been lending a hand to the Gulf Coast of Texas, bringing aid and supplies while assisting rescue crews, helping thousands ravaged by floodwaters of Hurricane Harvey.
Churches in this area organizing relief to take over to Texas. I've been talking to pastors there in the Houston area whose churches were flooded. They're working as hard as they can to get back on their feet so they can help their community that's been devastated.
You know, FEMA, they're going to leave. The government's going to step out. The Red Cross is going to move to the next disaster, which is great. But what about my city I love? What about our city? What about these families? Over 3,100 homes, which represented over 3,100 families, all displaced. And so as I think of how the church can partner, my hope is that they would walk with us, that they would know us.
We turn our attention to our next panel, Serving in Crisis, and the opportunities that that brings. Oh, by the way, one of the Benham brothers left his comb up here. I don't know if this was David or it was David. Okay, I got it for you, man. Don't worry, I got you covered. There you go, man. You gotta love those guys. There is a tremendous opportunity when we serve people in the time of need. Jesus, you think of the intersection of him revealing truth, was most often preceded by meeting a need of those that were in crisis. And so we want to have a panel discussion because I believe what we've seen in the last decade and a half is we have seen crisis upon crisis, man-made crisis, but natural disasters that are only growing in their magnitude and their reach. And to help us have this discussion are three pastors who have been involved in these issues in their communities, serving in the midst of crisis. Garrett Booth pastors Grace Church in Houston, along with his wife of over 20 years. Last summer, when over 50 inches of rain was dumped on Houston and the surrounding area, damaging 2,300 homes, of which over 12,000 were destroyed. Grace Church's sanctuary was literally looked like a river, but it became a river of blessing as Grace Church immediately began serving their community. So I'm going to ask Pastor Garrett to join me up here. Please welcome Pastor Garrett Booth. Art Sena, who is the pastor of Living Roots Christian Church in Santa Rosa, California, and a co-founder of Foster a Family Initiative, was created in response to the recent wildfires in Northern California. Art, along with his wife, Christina, and their three children, felt called to plant a church community in Santa Rosa just over 6 years ago. They feel called to live lives that are centered on intentionality, embracing the life of missionaries in their everyday lives. Art has a passion for uniting the church communities of Santa Rosa County and surrounding counties, and for working together to share the love of Christ through their hearts for the city and their actions toward the people there. Please welcome Pastor Art. Pastor Art, welcome. And then from my hometown, Pastor Mark Sturmer, a Marine veteran. All right, I was waiting. Is a senior and founding pastor of the Church International outside of Baton Rouge. Since launching it in 2006, the church now has 7 campuses, 4 schools, and a nonprofit spanning across the state and internationally. It also has broadcasting their services on television and online weekly. First responding to the needs of New Orleans and the surrounding area after Hurricane Katrina, Pastor Mark, working with a core group of pastors and the State Family Policy Council, the Louisiana Family Forum, they have created a statewide network of pastors that now state and local officials turn to for assistance during natural disasters. He and his wife, Cindy, have been married for 24 years. They have 8 children and 4 grandchildren. Please welcome Pastor Mark to the stage. We're going to allow our panelists. I'll turn myself on first. We're going to allow our panelists just to start with, again, as we have been, we're going to turn to your questions. So if you have questions about this, about whatever may come up during the panel, just go ahead and use your app and send those in, and we will get to our questions. So I'm going to start with Pastor Garrett.
Our story is really challenging. When the hurricane blew through Houston, our church was flooded with a couple of feet of water. And the sanctuary looked like a river, and as did the city. It was more than 3 trillion gallons of water in the space of 5 days. Unprecedented flooding all over the city of Houston. And so we knew there were going to be challenges everywhere. And so as soon as the water receded enough where people could get out of their houses, people from the church showed up at the church. The day the water went down enough where people could get out on the roads, there was more than 1,000 people that showed up at our church to help clean up not just our home there, our spiritual home, but also to get out in the community and start helping people and get out and start rescuing people. Obviously, there was a great need for that at the time, and see what we could do to be a light in our community. So that was kind of the nutshell of the story that happened there. And when I think about that, I would just share a couple of thoughts with all of us here. First, what made the relief efforts in Houston work from a body of Christ perspective is that there were pastors who knew each other and could connect together to help meet the needs. I can't underscore how important that is. And so the pastors were together on this. We were immediately on the phone because no one person or one church can handle a crisis. You can't do it by yourself. You absolutely can't. All you can do is plug in with the body of Christ and work together. And let me just say, the time to build those relationships is not in the crisis. The time to build those relationships is right now, because you're going to need them. So I just thought of a challenge for all of us. Let me just ask you a question. Nobody needs to respond to this, but just think about it. Do you have the phone number of 3 pastors from your city in your phone right now that you could call if a crisis happened? If the answer to that is no, I would challenge every one of you, when you go back to your city, to call some pastors, go have lunch, at least get to know each other, figure out that we're not the enemy like we've heard about today, and plug in together, because your community is going to need you. It may not be the kind of flood that we experienced, but Jesus did promise that natural disasters would start happening more and more as the earth started groaning for his return. So I just encourage all of us, this is an opportunity. It really is an opportunity, Tony. When crisis hits, people are incredibly open to help and the gospel. And I think that's that is the equation for making a difference in your community. It's hope and help. You got to give a cup of cold water, and you have to do it in Jesus' name. You give the water without Jesus' name, it's social work. You go preach Jesus without a cup of cold water to people who desperately need it, and it's religiosity. But if you will give a cup of cold water in the name of Jesus, you can make a difference for eternity. And so I just think we had an opportunity to do that, have had several. This was the most recent one, just as so many others have. Just by the numbers, we helped to connect with other churches in the city. We rebuilt almost 1,000 homes from the bottom up with volunteer effort from all over the country, about $10.5 million worth of work, while our church sustained multiple millions dollars worth of damage. We were already out in the community just making a difference and helping people right where they were, and that's what it's about.
And I want to underscore what Pastor Garrett said about you can't wait till you're in the middle of the storm. You've got to have those relationships ahead of time, because then it all just kind of comes together because you're in relationship with one another. And that is a part of being a Watchman pastor. It's about praying, it's about preaching, but it's about partnering with other pastors so that you can meet the needs of your community. And it's not just floods, but we have seen over the last 15 years, I guess the biggest disaster I saw first was Katrina, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But while the South has hurricanes, and we've got the tornadoes in the Midwest and some of the flooding up in the northern parts, in California and the West Coast, it seems to be the fires. And I don't know how it is, but they seem to be getting worse with each passing year. And Art, tell us about how you taking that opportunity to minister in your community.
Sure. So it really started 6.5 years ago when my wife and I moved to Santa Rosa to start a church community, planted church. We went really with the mentality that we were missionaries, not to Africa, but to 4 hours west from Reno, Nevada. We wanted to be missionaries in Santa Rosa, and with that mentality, we've always thought, my wife and I have been married 15 years, and we've always known when we leave our home, we're missionaries in our city. Well, then we had kids, and we realized when we leave our bedroom, we're missionaries in our house, because our kids aren't born believers. We have to give them Jesus over and over and every day. And so we had always this mentality of being missionaries in our town, and the first thing I did was to make sure I had 10 phone numbers of pastors in my phone. And I went to the different circles of pastors, prayer meetings, and groups, because I knew I can't pick up a car by myself, but if I had 10 friends, then we can move it. And so I went to the Pentecostal pastor meeting, this pastor meeting, the Baptist pastor meeting, and then we do these big groups. And like, man, you're like everywhere. What do you do? I'm like trying to find some friends, really. So it's been really hard, though, in the Bay Area to get churches to play together, if you will. But with the fires that took place, it was an open door for that. And so the small connections and the desire I had to unify the church together wasn't with the mentality that there's going to be a national disaster. It was more just like, I know we're stronger in numbers. Life is better when we're walking together. And so we were on the ground. We've been developing relationships. And then the fires took place October 8th on my son's birthday last year. And we went to bed. There was smoke in the air. We're thinking somebody's barbecuing. What is that? And the next morning, 2 in the morning, we woke up and were evacuated from our home. And over 300 homes were burnt in Santa Rosa. Over 5 square miles gone. We were hearing bombs go off, and it were propane tanks blowing up and gas lines, and it was scary. And so through that, my wife and I knew that we needed to do something. And there was so much help coming on the ground, making sandwiches and doing all these things. And we were thinking, what about in a month from now? What about 2 months? And so we started an initiative called Foster a Family. And the idea was, what if we got the whole church to operate on one database, putting all of their needs on one side and all of their assets on another side? And what if we had liaisons at each church community who saw the needs and assets and started connecting the dots? And it was just kind of pie in the sky idea, and then it started happening. And I also had a desire to raise funds, and so we raised over $700,000 from churches all over the country that wanted to help. And so they were able to be partnered with families to walk with them, whether it's providing trailers or cars that were melted or paid deposits to get them in apartments. we were able to help, and we're still helping. And the hope is that God would continue to provide funds, and the church will continue to work together, and we'll continue to serve in rebuilding our community, which we believe will take about 10 years. And so we're really blessed to be in this place and excited to be serving Jesus in this way.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Art. I've known Mark Sturmer, I don't know, for maybe 20 years now. We have been in floods, hurricanes, and political battles. And I'm not sure which are more intense, but
political.
As we worked with pastors and began to build a network of pastors in the state, it was long before the storms came. But when Hurricane Katrina came back in 2005 and devastated New Orleans and surrounding areas, it was at that point the network came together, and I remember it was days that we spent together responding to the need. But I want you to speak to the amazing doors that open when we are willing to serve. We now, in the state of Louisiana, when a crisis comes, state, local officials are calling the church at the table to help them solve these needs. And it's created unprecedented relationships through being willing to serve, whether it's water, food, places of shelter or clothing. So Mark, just kind of share what your experiences. You've been walking through that in the last 2 decades.
Well, when you think that it's not going to happen, it's going to happen. And, you know, in the state, I once, after all these disasters and going through all this, because every time one comes up, I'll tell my wife, I'll wake up and, or it's at midnight or whatever time it is, and I'll pack my bag and I'll say, baby, I'll see you when it's over. Because that's what we do. You know, the church is not like everybody else. We don't run away from the battle, we run to the battle. And, you know, it's going to come. It may be man-made. It may be through nature. When nature calls, you go, right? And so when nature calls, you have to move. But God trains you. You don't even realize what he's doing. When 9/11 happened, Pastor Carter, Pastor Dino was like, hey, we've got to help. And it's the heart of wanting to help, wanting to serve. And I remember getting a plane and just getting into New Jersey, and 2 days later I was at Ground Zero and bringing the needs that needed to go there. When the earthquake happened in Peru, Pastor Dino said, hey, you need to go over there. Going over there on the ground, just grabbing some stakes and working with the government and building communities for those that were destroyed. And so when Katrina happened, and then Rita, and then the Great Flood, it was real easy to know what to do and know how to engage because God had really already trained us. And really, Tony, talking about connection, it was you getting me to run for state senator that began those connections, because through that, I was able to get to know people I would have never known if I wouldn't have done that. And afterwards, you and Gene asked us to travel the state and form PRC, which is Pastors Resource Council, which turned into Pastors PRC Compassion, which is the network that when Katrina happened, we were able to move immediately, and we were housing 11,000 people, feeding 11,000 people and helping them. It was because of all the connections. But then even when it gets personal, I mean, this last flood, you flooded, you lost your house. And I remember working for 24 hours. It was a 3-day flood that never ended. And my arms were raw from throwing sandbags. And our house was going under. And I went and the water started going in our house. The sheriff calls me and he says, Pastor Mark, we need you up here. And I go there, and all the leaders from the community, from the DA, the sheriff, the attorney general, all these guys are in here, and they're looking to me, and I know my house is going under. I'm losing everything that I have, and I had to hold it together and take the authority that God's given me and say, guys, you know what we need to do? We need to pray, and we need to ask God for his strength, and we need to work together, put all of our banners down, and lift one banner of humanity and a banner in our community of Jesus Christ, and we're gonna just serve. And it just opened those doors to allow you to walk into places that normally you would never walk in as the church, and just to serve the people who needed it.
And they become residual relationships, and these relationships continue on. It's not just in the crisis, but then it becomes a friendship, and it becomes an opportunity to serve ongoing. We got a question that was sent in that was just through the app. Says, let me pull it back up here. How do we get our people motivated to serve where there's not a major disaster? And I want to address that from a standpoint of, as Mark said, our home flooded. I was actually the interim pastor of our church, second largest Baptist church in Baton Rouge, and about half our congregation flooded, 3/4 of our church property flooded. And, you know, I was there. I had been the pastor for about a month when this occurred. And I remember the first phone call I made when we had to evacuate out in 2 canoes. We had 10 feet of water in our driveway, and as we were paddling out, my wife turned around and looked at me. She said, "This is the kind of stuff you see on TV." And I said, "Well, welcome to reality TV." When as soon as I realized the magnitude of the crisis, the first phone call I made actually was to Franklin Graham and Samaritan's Purse. And within 48 hours, they were literally set up on the parking lot of our church as one of the resource centers. And so how I would answer that in part is that these, as Art, I don't know, Art or Garrett said, these things are not going away. Jesus said that as the earth groans, we are going to see these disasters. This is not global warming. This is God's warning, okay? And we better be ready. And by partnering with organizations like Samaritan's Purse, your people will be trained. Let me tell you what, I know there's a lot of good groups out there, and this is not in any way to take away from any of them, but there is not a better run organization when it comes to natural disasters than Samaritan's Purse. They are efficient, they're effective, they will train the volunteers, and so you can connect with them, your people. We now have a team that we are envisioning sending out when there are other disasters around the country so that we can plug in with them. But the church, people just naturally turn to the church in these moments of crisis. But if we're in crisis because we're not prepared, we will miss those opportunities. Now, Art, I have a question that's come in from you. How have you seen your response to your crisis change the way you are relating to other churches in your area?
Just to be honest, I didn't hear that question that you just read. I'm thinking of the previous question.
Yeah, let me read.
Could I speak into that previous question?
Absolutely, go right ahead.
For us, ever since we hit the ground in Santa Rosa, we've been equipping people to share the gospel with their spheres of influence, because there's disaster in every home. There's hurt and pain because of sin everywhere. And we don't need a huge disaster to take down city walls for us to know that there is always a need. And so we're constantly equipping the people in our church community to think about the spheres of influence that God has you in, whether it's your neighborhood, your workplace, your school environment, and to be asking questions and engaging people and find out through relationship where there's hurt, where there's bad news that they can bear good news into. And so we're constantly living in that state that there is a disaster all the time.
So I'm going to read the question for you. How have you seen your response to your crisis change the way you're relating to other churches in your area? Has it changed the dynamic?
Yes, it has. It has in tremendous ways. A part of all this, there's been a foundation of prayer in this, that God would soften hearts even within the church of how we connect together. But there's over 36 churches that are partnered with us, very open, inviting me into their communities to share from the pulpit or announcements of how we could be partnering this way and continuing to walk out this relationship. We do trainings constantly on how to navigate and exist within this initiative, as well as now we're equipping, so 8-9 months later, we're now equipping people in how to share the gospel while they're interacting with fire survivors. And that's been a really neat experience. And through this, the city of Santa Rosa, which has not been known to connect with what they would say the faith-based communities, they have hired 2 people, one from the city to the churches as a liaison, and the biggest school district in town to have a liaison to work from the school district to the churches. And that is the first time in history in Santa Rosa, and it's been a really neat experience. I was just, before the trip here on Tuesday, was on a middle school campus as they were creating during lunch with 7th and 8th graders a place where they can grieve and continue to debrief about the loss of their home. And the church was represented there, and we were able to deliver summer kits with towels and swim trunks and goggles and sunscreen, and just continue to bear good news in word and deed. And so it's been a really neat experience.
Let me throw this one up for any of our panelists. What do you do when you don't have enough resources to serve your city sufficiently and in the right way in the midst of a crisis? How do you get other ministries to support you?
Well, it's being connected, like you said, Samaritan's Purse, or the Baptists have great resources with bringing in cooking teams. And Tony, I want to say this. You also have to be willing to connect with the community, because there were a lot of guys that wanted to come in and cook, but they wouldn't church folk. And they would come in, and I'd just say, hey, you know, if you drink, just don't let me see it, you know. But they were cooking, and they were serving everyone because they wanted to serve. But in that, we build relationships.
Now I'm going to ask you this now. In South Louisiana, did you ask them what they were cooking?
Well, you know, I was telling my brother, I said, in South Louisiana, just give us some rice, and that's all we need, because we can get, you know, the Nutri-Rad and the
any kind of meat will work,
huh?
Yeah.
You know, whatever out of the water, and we'll just make jambalaya. So.
All right.
But no, it's connecting to those organizations and being willing and open. You know, God had given me a vision in the inner city campus that there were thousands of people on the campus, but they wasn't in the church. They were on the campus, and this was years before Rita. This was under Rita, and I'm thinking, yeah, everybody's going to come to church there. And I didn't realize it wasn't our church service. It was the hurricane. And I remember them calling me and saying, Pastor, there are thousands of people on our property, and they're sitting all over the property. Samaritan's Purse was there, and we're serving them, and we're feeding them, because we have fed hundreds of thousands of meals to people during this time. And it just comes in. I remember times when I was on the board for Katrina, and we had the board, and we would literally have a need of, it would be diapers or water or whatever it was, and we'd literally stop and just pray and say, God, we need this. And we'll get a phone call from people we don't even know and say, I have an 18-wheeler of that very thing, and it'd be headed our way. And we'd say, send it, and we'd get it, and we'd get it distributed out.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Resources are going to come to you if there's a disaster. Once it's on the news or churches find out about it, people will do drives. One of the questions you were asking earlier, what do you do if you're in a place where you don't have a lot of this? You can always take an offering. You can go challenge people to bring a gift card with them next Sunday. Put it in a box, send it to a pastor, because that's an easy way for people on the ground to get help to people who desperately need it. It's something simple, and it won't affect your offerings. Just tell everybody, get a gift card this week, bring it back. Keep that going for 2 or 3 weeks. That said, resources will come your way. Being a distribution point doesn't cost you a thing. And so if you connect with the government officials or other ministries that are there, the church can be the best distribution point in the community. And so water, food, diapers, the things that people need right in the middle of the crisis, you can give those out, get them distributed. I think every church ought to be knowledgeable about how to be a shelter if there was a crisis where people need a shelter. I think that's something that doesn't cost you anything, to open the doors and have some people there and just take care of people. And, you know, being a giver in the community that way can make a huge difference. It don't always have to cost anything. Last thing I'd say is this. The question said, what if you don't have enough resources to handle the thing in your community? No church will ever have enough resources to handle the disaster in your community. It has to be all of us together and all of the body of Christ together, working in these areas where there's this kind of hurt.
Tony, let me say something. This is very important, guys. All of us run churches and budgets. If we run all the way 100% of our budget, I'm going to tell you something. When something like this happens, you can get yourself in a bind very quick. I have a 20% margin that we do not run out of, so that when these opportunities take place, we can actually do something immediately. But the other thing is, and you don't think about this, but when you're flooded and you can't have church Sunday, that means no tithe comes in either. and you still got staffs you got to pay, and you got bills you got to pay, and they do not go away. And so if you're not ready, I'm just saying we live in an era where we tell people in their personal life that you need to have an emergency fund. And I think as a church, we need to have emergency funds just for carrying your staff, just simply carrying your staff through 2-3 weeks of no tithe, and then they having no jobs, which is going to affect the tithe for the next 3-4 months. I mean, this is serious stuff.
With that, that's fantastic. That's how we run our home budget. That's how we ought to run our church family budget as well. What we've experienced with the churches all over the country in the Bay Area sending resources to personally adopt families or foster families, my hope is that we in the North Bay can respond the same way wherever in the country. Because I agree, you can't, as an individual congregation, take care of any disaster in that way, but God has been so faithful in blessing the church as a whole with everything we need if we were to walk together in it.
Yeah, let me address that resource issue, because in this room are the resources. We even though the church property was flooded, our sanctuary was not. And so within 24 hours, we had turned our sanctuary into a relief center where we began to provide the supplies. And many of you in this room, I called, and you sent supplies, you sent volunteers, you sent resources. And one of the questions that came in, is there a blessing in the midst of these disasters? Absolutely, there's tremendous blessings. As people come in who have lost everything, you think about it, they have a choice to go into a church, or they have a choice to go to a secular relief center that is just going to meet the physical need. I cannot tell you the number of people I prayed with. And we saw, just in the weeks after the flood, over 150 people come to Christ through the outreach of the disaster-oriented ministry that we did. In our church now, we have a disaster relief fund that stays there ready to respond to like Houston. We sent one of our cooking teams down to Garrett's church along with some buckets. We keep buckets with cleanup supplies. You'd think that that's not a big deal, but when you're trying to clean out your house and you try to go to a store and buy something that everybody in your community wants, you're not going to find it. So these being a resource center for those in the community, but resourced by other churches around the country. Yeah. And this is one of the visions I have for our Watchmen network, is not only to be an influence in the culture and in the political realm, but to be a resource for one another when we walk through these natural disasters, because I have a lot of confidence when I say this that they're going to continue. And we're going to continue to see these challenges. And so we want the Watchmen network of pastors to be there for one another when we go through this, so that you can call one of the pastors you met here, or you reach out to a pastor that you met at the Watchmen conference that's in a community that's been impacted by this. And you see those relationships are critical.
Can I speak into that a little bit? So we've experienced blessings in so many different ways. One, on the level of being able to extend, like buying a trailer for a family, a husband and wife, and they're just in tears when they're receiving this kind of generosity, and we get to talk about the generosity of Christ, and then they come to know Christ through that experience. I mean, that's the greatest blessing we've experienced in our church community. But we're a small church community, church plant, and so we're kind of like nomads on Sundays, and we've been gathering in my house for quite a while. And there was a church property in downtown, and I don't know if this is correlated, if this is God's blessing us because of what we've done. I don't know any of that, but what I do know, we raised over $700,000, though we're a small church community of like 50, and we're not even self-supported. I can't even get a full salary yet, but we're giving that money away to other church communities. We've seen this church building built in 1886 in the heart of Santa Rosa, and it was for sale. And it was been for sale since 2009 because it had a burnt down building. Nobody wanted it. And my wife and I started praying around that building for a while, years. And 3 weeks ago, we were invited to sit with the leadership. There was 10 ladies. They're all widows in their 80s and 90s. And they said, oh, we'd like to give you this building for free. We were in tears. The building in the heart of Santa Rosa is like $1.7 million. Nobody wanted it because of the state it was in, but the church sanctuary of 2,200 square feet. My wife and I, it's like, we just need a big house to meet in. That's it. And God said, here you go. And we've been there 3 weeks, and it's been such a blessing. And I believe God is going to do something in that place, in the heart of that city, as we continue to minister to that community. And we're so blessed and thankful. And God's very faithful in this. So anyways.
I mean, it's been said you can't outgive God. And God looks for those who are not going to be a reservoir, but a river that he can flow through. I want to, in the few moments we have left, Mark, I want to talk to you about ask you about one aspect, and that is ministering to the first responders in these crises, because as you mentioned, many of them leave their homes, and we've seen where trees have fallen on their homes. They've had to leave, and so by sending in teams to cut up the trees and pull them off of their houses, it removes the stress and the tension for them to serve, but the relationships and the doors that opens.
It truly is amazing. That's one of the things you have to do. I mean, you and I have been on top of houses cutting trees off of first responders who were serving. And I think when the disaster happens, the first thing you have to do is you run to it, and you take ground, and you look for the thing that no one else wants to do. And you do that, and you become invaluable. And they're going to want you, and they're going to want you to be there. So one of the things that's really easy and we do well is feed people. And so we feed the first responders, and we make sure they're taken care of. We find out where their houses are. We go clean them out. And like you said, what it does is it builds this rapport where anything we're doing, we go now and just say, hey, guys, I'd like to do, oh, it's the church. Yeah, y'all have it. No one can mess with us on anything because we take care of each other now. And we really are a community. It's not a church and then a government and this church. We're together. And it also, Tony, opens up a platform to preach God's message to the world. Because each time, I know with Katrina, CNN and Diane Sawyer was in our inner city. And they came down there, Donaldsonville, came down there in the inner city, and Jesse Jackson and all these guys were there, and it was an interesting dynamic, to say the least. But we were able to communicate a message out to the nation. And the same thing this time, Trump came to the church and brought an 18-wheeler, and he was a candidate then, and I was able to get on CNN for about 6 minutes and really just talk about the Lord. And with all the racism and everything, I just sent the message. The flood didn't care what color you were. And the bigger story is not the flood, but it's the fact that we love one another and we help one another. And that's what we need to be looking to and doing in our nation. So it sets a platform so that you can speak to the world when you just decide to serve.
And it is serving everyone who comes through the door. It doesn't matter color, creed, doesn't matter orientation. And I remember we had, I'm kind of known for what I believe. And we had a guy come to our church after the flood and was, obviously distraught. And our folks were praying with him and offering what help he needed. He said, well, I'm a homosexual. You're not going to want to help me. And he said, absolutely, we're going to help anybody who walks through these doors. And I believe we've got to be willing to meet every need that we can in the community. And the result of that is that all of a sudden, they don't see us the way the world would want to describe us. They see us as loving them, as caring for them, which we do, but in that moment of crisis, there's nothing standing in the way. And so the key part of that is being prepared. Yes. And so I want to encourage you, as Pat, you may say, well, I live in an area where we don't have any disasters. Don't say that. Don't say that. I remember telling my wife before the flood came, I said, you know what, I just feel like I operate at my peak when I'm in the middle of a crisis. And 2 days later, a flood came, and I got a year experience. So you need to be prepared for the opportunities that are going to come your way. And in terms of feeding the first responders, how many of you have kitchens in your churches? How many of you have cooking teams? Any of you have mobile kitchens? A few of you. I'm going to throw this out there. How many of you as a Watchmen church would be willing to use your church site as a feeding site if you had the resources, had the kitchen to feed first responders in a disaster? How many would be willing to do that? Well, what if we had a Watchmen cooking trailer that was dispatched to anywhere in the nation to stand with our Watchmen pastors to serve in that community? Wow. Well, we're going to do that because as we now have 15,000 Watchmen pastors, we need to be standing together as a band of brothers to meet the needs in those communities. And that's a vision we have, is to be able to serve in these crises, to make a difference so that we can present the gospel and change our communities. We've got just a couple of minutes left, and I'm going to give each of our panelists an opportunity just to kind of give some parting thoughts. And I'm going to start with you, Garrett.
So you were talking about being prepared. I was thinking about that. I think there's 3 ways all of us can do that. You need to prepare physically. So if you're in a place where there might be disasters, it's coming around to hurricane season, we're going to have water on site. We're going to have some gas on site. We're going to have some money ready to go. So those kind of physical preparations. 2, you need to prepare your people. Somebody asked, well, how do you get where the people just respond like that? Well, they don't do that just on their own. You got to talk about it. So say, folks, you know what? If something happened in our city, like the wildfires in California, if you're here, come to the church, because you know what? We're called to be a light in those moments and not to shrink back. So start to teach that in your church and get your leaders and your volunteers ready so they know when that happens, nobody had to make a phone call. We didn't send out an email. The water went down, the people showed up, and that's what you want. The 3rd thing is to prepare a plan. What does happen? If there's a crisis, what does your church staff do? How do you contact, and who do you contact? And then the last thing I would say about that is, if at all possible, be physically present in your community. It's very difficult to do you can't chop trees down if you left. Now, I know that sometimes safety requires us to do that, but if you can at all physically possibly be in the community, that speaks huge volumes to people when you are there. It comes down to you either were there or you weren't there. And if you're there, in all that serving, it gives us the right to speak about the issues that matter so much to us. We earn the right to speak by serving. And when we serve, whoever serves the best, their voice gets to be the loudest. So we could all earn that right in our own communities that way. So that's just some parting thoughts about getting prepared for all of us.
Amen. One is to piggyback off of what you guys were talking about, first responders, and what we're experiencing now, serving the second responders and even third responders with the city and the county employees who had to open up departments to now deal with rebuilding the city. And we're trying to serve them today, and that's going to go on for a long while. And so just be thinking about all the different people and the weight of the impact of the disasters that might take place and how we can be bringing the better wine to the party. Or that's a Sonoma County thing, by the way, and a Jesus thing. So that concept, but I do want to also invite you into repenting if you haven't had the mentality of serving, because it starts with the leaders. It starts with the elders. It starts with the senior pastors, the staff. If our heart's not there, and all we're thinking about is our own ministries and not how to be plugged into the city and what God would want to be doing through us in our cities, I think it ought to start with repentance in that. And then in prayer, that God would open up our hearts, that we would see what Christ sees, and then we could then fill the gaps. So.
Yeah, I would say just make the most of every opportunity. And that's what God says, make the most of the opportunity when it presents itself to all people, and especially to those that are household of faith. And the thing about opportunities is when they come, you have to change what you're doing. You know, right. Pastor Carter, you talked about that where God showed you to cancel all those services, never even knew why, and then all of a sudden, boom. I will say this, God will normally show you that something's coming, and you just got to do something, and you start getting prepared. And I'll leave you with this. My father-in-law one time asked me, he said, man, come pick the corn. I have a couple acres of corn to pick. And I looked at my calendar. I said, well, I can't this weekend. How about, let's see, 3 weekends from now I'll be available. And he looked at me, he said, son, he said, in farming, when the crop's ready, you adjust your calendar to the crop. And I find many times we want the crop to adjust to our calendar, and we need to learn how to adjust our calendar to the crop, because the crop is there and the people are there. And when they need to be helped, it doesn't matter what our schedules say. We have to put that aside and do what's right.
Amen. Amen. Well, it will disrupt your schedule, but it will give you experiences, and the Lord, if you yield to Him, will bless you in ways you never envisioned. Just a couple of practical thoughts to close out along with what has been shared. Is one thing I found at the very top, the first thing I wanted to do was check on my members, is find out their status, because we wanted to work first in our church and then work out into the community. So how many of you can have a system in place where you can find out immediately the status of your members? It took us, unfortunately, because we didn't have a system, it took us about 3 days to have volunteers come in and call through the entire list. And I should have been prepared, but I wasn't. I remember back in Katrina, the Israeli embassy had a list of every Jewish citizen or Israeli citizen that was living in New Orleans, and had a list of their address and everything, and had gotten some law enforcement officers to go in and check on each one of them. They know where every one of their people are. We ought to know where every one of our people in our congregation, as we shepherd them, where they are, and be able to check on them immediately. And then don't wait until disaster strikes to have the resources set aside for it, whether it's for your church or for someone else, another church that you want to minister to or through, and have some people trained. Don't wait until the crisis is upon you to then go through the training. I have to believe that this is going to be a part of our ministry as churches, and it's an opportunity to reach into our communities if we are available. So let's thank our panel for sharing their experiences with us today.